Today, we're excited to introduce our listeners to Embrace and their new Flutter SDK. Embrace's Flutter SDK is a game changer for Flutter developers. With its easy integration and powerful insights, you can gain a comprehensive understanding of your app's performance and user behavior. You'll be able to monitor your app startup time, view network requests, and track user sessions all in one place. But what sets Embrace apart is their dedication to providing actionable insights. Their SDK goes beyond telling you what's wrong, it also provides recommendations for how to fix the issues. This means you can spend less time diagnosing problems and more time improving your app. So if you're a Flutter developer looking to take your app to the next level, head over to Embrace and check out their new Flutter SDK. You'll gain a deeper understanding of your app's performance and your users' behavior, and you'll be able to make data-driven decisions to improve your app. Be sure to visit dash.embrace.io/APM to sign up for a free trial, learn more about their Flutter SDK, and take your app to new heights. Hello, welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today we have Ethan Elshyeb, who is the creator of Flutter Eval. Welcome, Ethan. How are you?
Hi, Alan. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be on the show.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. And I'm happy to hear that you're working on a similar product as a previous guest, right? The Hydro SDK, this Flutter Eval, right? It's a way to hot code reload Flutter.
Yeah, so I've talked with Chris before. He's the creator of Flutter of Hydro SDK, and yeah, he's Hydro SDK is a really cool product that he made, and we'd spoken before, and a lot of what I've done is actually inspired by his work. Yeah.
I think we need to kind of roll back a little bit. Like, you know, you seem quite young to me. So, I don't know, are you still in school or are you actually working full time? I'm kind of curious about your background.
Yeah, so I'm working full time at a web development place in Colorado here. So yeah, I'm not really mostly working with Flutter, but we have explored a few Flutter products.
Now, actually, what got you into Flutter? You're saying you're a web developer, but Flutter and web, I mean, of course, there's some relation, but not a lot.
Yeah, so back a few years ago, I was working with a friend creating our own startup app, and it was like this app for finding quotes to use in essays for school essays. And so, yeah, I was looking around at all the different options. I actually explored just coding in native iOS for a little bit, and it just became really clear to me that like the native options weren't that great, and I looked into using Flutter, and I just kind of immediately fell in love. I was like, wow, this is so much better, especially than I had been doing Android development for a while, but especially compared to iOS development with Xcode. I just found Xcode to be a complete nightmare, and so yeah, when I dove into Flutter, I was like, wow, this is totally a completely different level of user experience. And so yeah, I dove into making this like app using Flutter. At the time, I actually used Angular Dart, I believe, to create the web version of it as well, so we could share code between Android, iOS, and the web. And it was a really cool project, and I really enjoyed working with it. And since then, I've just sort of been in the Flutter ecosystem, working on various different packages and Flutter projects.
Now, what happened to the startup? Did you guys get any traction or are you a millionaire now?
It got a little bit of traction, but it's not around anymore. I probably made like $2,000 off of it.
It's probably more than what most people make on most startups, to be honest. Usually people kind of leave, at least investors are kind of high and dry sometimes, right? A lot of people do these things go bust for some sad reason.
Right.
So you made 2,000 in revenue. Were you guys funded or how was your kind of journey?
No, it was just a really small thing between me and my friend. We just published this app on the App Store and on the Google Play Store. Um, it didn't really like work on it. We just sort of were working on it after school. And over time, we just got some traction. I think the web version was a huge boost to our traction. We got a lot of our revenues from Google search. People seeing the quotes that we had, and they were doing Google searches for a specific book, and then coming and looking them up on our website.
Now, how did you come across Flutter, right? Because there's so many other choices. Of course, I think probably the most popular one is React Native, right? So what brought Flutter onto your radar?
Oh wow, I don't even remember at this point. That was like what, 6 years ago. So yeah, I couldn't totally tell you.
Now, things have definitely changed since then, right? And you're still using Flutter for other projects, or you're just using it only in your free time?
Yeah, so we've looked into using it at my work, and there's certainly projects that we would do with it if it was like a mobile project. But yeah, I would say for the most part, my usage of Flutter is for my in my free time on my personal projects, and I have a few projects besides just like Flutter eval, but um, yeah, that's sort of the main one.
But now I'm kind of curious about what got you interested to start working on using that hot code reload part.
So first of all, when you look around at like the Flutter ecosystem, like the number one most upvoted issue in the Flutter GitHub repository is Flutter code push. And in fact, I saw this stat the other day and I almost couldn't believe it. It's like the 20th most upvoted issue on the entirety of GitHub. Not even Flutter specific, but the all of GitHub. It's like the 20th most upvoted issue. So there's this huge demand for it. But for me, like my story with it actually started a little bit earlier. I was really interested in Flutter Desktop when that was first becoming a thing. I think this was back in like 2019, probably, that Flutter Desktop was not an official Google project yet, but it was being worked on by someone at Google, and there was like this unofficial GitHub repository for it. So I was really interested in that, and I went and I started working on making this Flutter IDE, um, and so it was basically just like this like demonstration that, oh, you can actually use Flutter Desktop for more than just like taking your like little mobile app and blowing it up on a big screen. No, you can actually make real desktop apps with this. Um, and I think it was like this Flutter IDE project that I made. I was also using Dart FFI and brought in like a full terminal, and I made this demo where I took this Flutter IDE and I loaded its own project inside of it, and you know, uh, compiled it using itself, and then hot reloaded it using its own terminal. So it was basically self-hosting Flutter, and I posted that demo, and I think that was the first thing that I posted that like really got a lot of traction. People were like, "Wow, you can use Flutter Desktop to actually make real desktop apps." Um, so I think the long-term goal with that project was to have something that would actually have like a drag and drop visual UI editor for Flutter. And so I started working on a few prototypes of that, where you would be able to drag and drop like little Flutter components in, and then it would like update the code on the side, and then it would show you what had changed. And I pretty quickly realized that you needed to have like a actual Dart interpreter in order to do that in any reasonable way, because Flutter code is so built around this idea that you have the full power of Dart available to you. You can do so many things that you can't do in other frameworks because you are actually just writing directly in a programming language. You're not using XML or some weird like you know plist file that's describing the UI. You're just using code. Um, so after making a few prototypes, I sort of went into like, okay, I need to actually build a Dart interpreter in order to get this to work. So that's sort of the origin of Flutter Eval.
Dart interpreter, that's a pretty big step now.
Yeah, I think it seemed more approachable to me because I built these like smaller prototypes incrementally. Like the first one was just something that essentially looked up like the different widget class names in a map of like string to like the uh, like a closure that created the class. Um, so I already had that working, and I was like, oh, okay, well, this works. Now the next step is just make it a Dart interpreter. I was maybe a little bit naive in that assumption. It's not. It's a much larger level of work, but I'm really happy that I chose to pursue it because it's really interesting and fun and a hard problem to solve.
I mean, hasn't this problem kind of been solved already with like the Dart VM? I mean, isn't that basically a Dart interpreter?
Yeah, so um, Dart eval is a little bit different than the Dart VM. Um, what you're doing with the Dart VM really is it's taking all of the code and it's compiling it to one big program that runs on its own standalone. And I think the biggest difference with Dart eval is that you're only compiling some of the code, right? You're compiling the user written code, but you're not compiling the entire Flutter framework. You're not compiling the core Dart libraries. Um, so I think really the biggest challenge with Dart eval has been how do you make it so that you can just write this user code and then have it link to the Dart code that's already been written in the Dart VM. It's a little bit challenging to explain sort of this difference, but like if you think about it, when you're going and you're writing a Flutter app, like you're going to create like a container, right? And your Flutter code is going to create the container. Now, if you're writing that in the Dart VM, the Dart VM is compiling your code that's creating the container, but it's also compiling the Flutter SDK, which has the container in it, right? So it's compiling everything. It's compiling your code, it's compiling the Flutter code, all the way down the stack, and compiling even the core Dart libraries to some extent. And Dart eval has to figure out a way to not do that. It has to figure out a way to say, okay, well, you're just creating this container. Now go and create the container over in Dartland, and then come back here once you're done.
Sounds very complicated. I mean, I don't know. I just feel like it'd just be easier just to ship the Dart VM rather than to build an interpreter.
Yeah, so there's some like advantages to both approaches, and I think if you're looking at the like market of code push, there's Shorebird is the other sort of like up and coming big approach, and that's essentially what they're doing is they're just taking the Dart VM and they're compiling it using that, and they're hot updating by just pushing a new like libapp.so file, which contains like all of your compiled code. And there's sort of advantages and disadvantages here. Obviously, the big advantage to that is they get to reuse all of the existing Dart compilation infrastructure. All of the existing tooling is there. They support 100% of the Dart language out of the box, which makes a ton of sense. There's a few disadvantages. So the first big disadvantage to that is that they don't support iOS. iOS, there is not really any way to get that to run that compiled code. Like the iOS flat out blocks JIT execution. So the code that they're running can't actually work on iOS. They're gonna have to come up with some other solution, which might be something like Dart eval or something using possibly WebAssembly in the future. And the other disadvantage, or one other disadvantage at least, is security. So in Dart eval, you can partially update just one single component in your app. Like maybe all you need to update is your login screen. You don't need to update any of the rest of your app. So what you can do is you can go and create this very targeted update that just modifies your login screen. And you can grant this running this like update access to only the very specific permissions that you need to give it for that login screen. Like maybe it'll only like the only endpoint it needs to be able to hit is the /API/login endpoint. So that's the only network call it's allowed to make is going to /API/login. And it's not allowed to do any file system writing. It's not allowed to make any other network calls. And so you're actually completely safe. Like there's nothing an attacker can do to grab those login credentials because the only endpoint it's allowed to hit is your own server's API login endpoint. Whereas with something where you're updating like the entire app code, well, there's just no way to enforce that, right? You can say, well, it's only allowed to hit like these, 30 endpoints and, read like, this file system. But, like if you want to add a new feature, that's not really sustainable because you can't make any other API calls. So Dart eval has this ability to make these very targeted and very secure, like guaranteed updates. And also because it's these very targeted updates, you can continue to run the entire rest of your app code in um, in full Dart AOT compilation. So this login screen might be running inside of Dart eval, so it's going to be a little bit slower, but the rest of your app code is still running at 100% full speed, compiled using the Dart VM, completely native. And I think that's kind of a pretty big advantage.
Okay, so in order to run this, you have to actually rewrite some of the pieces using special widgets, right? I think they're basically one-to-one copies in terms of like the outside, the way it looks and works on the outside. No.
Sorry, which one are you talking about?
Well, what I'm trying to what I understand is that because I was looking at the README over here, and you're saying over here that where was it? So you have all right, so you have a stateless widget in your example, the first example you have, and you have a hot swap loader, right? And so this one's pointing to an EVC file, and that's basically the update file or like the latest version of that page, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so every time it's going to have to keep pulling that URL. Like, so if I close my app and then return it back on, it has to pull that from the server and then run
Yeah,
that.
so it downloads the latest EVC file, and then that EVC file contains like instructions for which parts of the app to update, basically.
Okay. So if there's no network access, then basically there's no default widgets to show at this point, or that's not there's a fallback.
So if there's no network access, what it's going to do is it just falls back to the child parameter of that widget. So basically, if you put in those hot swap widgets, so basically the architecture of this is you have your existing app, right? And then you go in every place in your app where you want to be able to make a change at some point in the future. You put in a hot swap widget. And by default, these don't do anything at all, right? So these just directly fall back to your regular app and everything runs as normal. Then if you want to code push an update, you're going to upload this EDC file to the URI you specify in the top level hot swap loader widget. And then if it pulls that and it finds that it exists, then it's going to swap out any of these components that you've overridden with the update.
Okay, I see. So then every time you close it, reopen it, has to re-download just in case something's missing, right?
Yeah, so every time you close it and reopen it, it's gonna like recheck and see if there's a new update available.
I mean, how big can those files be? I mean, that sounds like it could be quite big, no?
Yeah, so right now you see a typical one being probably around 200 to 300 kilobytes. It's and most of that is really just because of the Flutter icons class. Like entirely that file is like I don't know 4,000 lines long. It's insane. And so if you actually write like some code, it's not going to change that much. It'll go from like 250 kilobytes to like maybe 350 kilobytes after you've added a few overrides.
Yeah, I'm trying to go through a doc and seeing how to actually create this EBC file, but I do see that you have you have a dot eval, and then you have bindings inside there is flutter eval.json. That flutter eval.json file is what is that one doing exactly? Let's see.
Yeah, so the way that it works is you've got so Flutter eval and Dart eval are two connected projects, right? Flutter eval is based on Dart eval, and Dart eval provides like the whole runtime and the compiler, and then Flutter eval is basically the bindings to Flutter and the way to use it easily in Flutter. So when you're compiling your update, Dart eval compiler needs to be informed of all of these Flutter classes that it has access to. So Flutter eval.json is basically a serialized version of all of the descriptions of the Flutter classes to the Dart eval compiler. So it becomes aware of them and knows how to work, how to compile Flutter code.
And those are all the ones tagged with the hot swap, right?
So hot swap is more of a convenience class. It's it's just to allow you to easily use the Flutter eval and the Dart eval runtime in your Flutter code. Like Flutter eval, to break it down, it has like sort of a few separate parts. One of them is the compile time descriptors, and these basically just like describe the entire layout of every class in an app. Um, like it describes all the methods on each class, and it describes the types that they return and what type each class extends for all the Flutter classes. And that's what gets serialized to JSON and passed to the Dart eval compiler. So the Dart eval compiler takes that, compiles it down to this like bytecode. Then you have the Dart eval runtime. So the Dart eval runtime is what's going to actually take this bytecode that's been compiled and run it. And so for that, Flutter eval has runtime classes that actually get created by the Dart eval runtime. So it'll like say, oh, go and create a container widget. And then Flutter eval will be able to look up the name container and turn that into a widget, into its like bridged container widget, which has, which is just like a wrapper around the container widget that gives it the ability to look up methods by string. So it can, if you want to call the build method, you can look that up by the string build, and it'll be able to find that method, which you can't do in normal Dart, obviously. So then the third component of Flutter eval is like the hot swap loader and hot swap. And those are basically just the convenience classes that wrap the Dart eval runtime and make it easy to stick it into your widget tree.
Okay, interesting. So we can actually use the Dart eval in just plain Dart projects and do something similar where we can just hot push.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are using it for that. I've looked at the GitHub like dependencies graph, and the number one top use for Dart eval is just to make a calculator.
A calculator? Is it that calculators are just so hard that they want to keep hot updating them? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Dart eval is very overkill for making a calculator.
Well, calculators aren't so easy, but yeah, they're also kind of been done many times.
Right.
Now the EVC, right? Why EVC? Is that evaluated code? Maybe I don't know what EVC would stand for.
It just means like eval code.
Okay.
Yeah, I had originally called it DBC for like Dart bytecode, but then it turned out that DBC was actually a real thing that the official Dart compiler uses to create its own bytecode. So I stopped using that name and switched to EVC.
Yeah, so you have to install this Dart eval CLI and then actually run it. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that you can use Flutter eval. This like the code push is sort of like the what I think will be the biggest use case. But you could also use it to make something completely different, like a educational app where you're teaching people how to code with Dart, because you can use it sort of to just like directly evaluate Dart code inside your apps. That's maybe more of what the example is showing, is how to use it in that sense. And I think that's also another pretty cool use case for Flutter eval. It's if you look, that it's linked to evalpad, which is basically Dartpad, but it's running using Flutter eval, so it can run on iOS and anywhere else. And yeah, you can just directly, one of the big things that I tried to do was make the Dart eval compiler really fast. So the like normal Dart compiler, if you're taking your program and you're compiling, it's going to probably take like somewhere around 20 seconds to compile. But the Dart eval compiler can compile a pretty reasonably sized Flutter program in like 200 milliseconds.
I mean, where do you even learn to start creating something like this? I mean, I understand it's baby steps, but like, what kind of resources were you relying on?
Yeah. A big helpful one actually was Crafting Interpreters by, I believe it's Bob Nystrom, who is one of the creators of the Dart language. I looked at that book, is pretty amazing. So if anyone wants to check it out, that's like a fantastic resource for learning about how to create interpreters and stuff like this.
I've been wanting to get him on the show because everybody, even outside of Dart, people are always referencing that book.
Oh yeah,
and
totally.
That's a pretty recent book too. It's like a couple of years, if even that. It's like last year or something. Super recent.
Yeah, I know, it came out very recently. So it's yeah, he's quite amazing, and that book is pretty fantastic in terms of. I was lucky enough to have started working on the bytecode version of Dart eval after it came out, because Dart eval used to just be like a direct AST interpreter, which was great for like testing, but it was incredibly slow. I saw a a lot of people being like, wow, this is like 2,000 times slower than Dart. And it's like, oh, I need to make a bytecode interpreter. And I think Chris really pushed me to do that as well.
Yeah, why don't we kind of talk about that? Because I'm kind of curious because obviously, I mean, there must be some things that are shared, but I think your solutions are quite different to a certain extent. I mean, obviously the implementation is quite different because his is got TypeScript and Lua, but yours is just straight Dart, if I understand correctly, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's actually a little bit more similar than you might think, because he's using a Lua bytecode interpreter uh, inside of Flutter to basically run Hydro, and so that was definitely an inspiration to me, seeing that that could work. I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna make. I made my own bytecode, but it's still quite similar. Um, yeah, I think Hydro is a very cool project, and when you look at it, like it's using this like TypeScript compiler to take your TypeScript code and then generating this Lua bytecode out of it and running it. And I think that's just because like it's super easy to run Lua bytecode. Like I think there was already a Dart Lua bytecode interpreter out there that Chris like took and updated and used. Um, and then, you know, one of the really cool things he created was SWID, which is structured wrapper interface something or other, and it's basically an automatic generator for bindings. So in Dart eval, what I have to do is every time I want to add support for a new Flutter class, I have to go and write this like binding for it, where it has the compile time binding, which I described. So it tells the compiler like the layout of the class and everything that's in it, and also has this runtime binding so that it can go and access the fields and methods when it's actually running. So one thing I've wanted to do for a while is create a automatic binding generator, and Chris did that for Hydro SDK, and it's pretty cool. It can handle a lot of interesting cases and just like sort of ingest the entire Flutter SDK and make this big like blob of bindings that just like let you use pretty much any class. And yeah, I talked with him about actually integrating that into Dart eval. Ultimately, I think he's no longer working on Hydro SDK at the moment because he got a job at Apple, I believe. But yeah, I definitely want to make something like that at some point. The only reason I haven't really is because of GitHub Copilot. So, I was like, oh man, I really need to make a binding generator, and then GitHub Copilot came out, and all of a sudden, like, it's still like not great, but I can like, write like what I sort of like a little bit of what I want, and then just auto complete the rest of the file, and it usually works pretty well. So I have decided to use that for the time being.
Okay, I didn't know that he stopped working on Hydro SDK. I actually haven't caught up with him in quite some time. Yeah, it's too bad. I just took a look at the project. There's quite a few PRs waiting over there.
Yeah, yeah, it's a little bit sad.
Yeah, because I mean,
but I hope I can continue his legacy.
well, actually, it looks like most of the PRs are just package upgrades from GitHub.
Yeah. There's been a few like over the years. There's been quite a few like code push projects. Like Chimera was another big one that a lot of people were looking at, and I never actually tested it, but it claimed to be able to compile or to be able to run the entire Flutter gallery, which is sort of like still pretty far out of reach for Flutter eval. So, but that package also hasn't been updated in like a year.
What I find interesting is, like you said, like you're saying it's the 20th most popular kind of feature request, or at least issue on GitHub for Flutter. And I'm aware that the Flutter team is kind of pushing it off and saying that they think the investment is not really worth the outcome, and also kind of you're going to have a slowdown in performance, right?
Right.
But why doesn't? Because there's so many people who are. I actually follow that thread, I believe, at least one of them, and there's a huge amount of interest, and there's also a huge amount of people just dropping names like, "Hey,
Yeah.
I'm working on it," or "These guys are working on it," and I wish that they would just come together and rally around just a couple of solutions, because I feel like there's like around 10 or so, I think, that have come out.
Yeah, there's quite a few, and I haven't looked at all of them. The main ones I've looked at are, Hydra SDK. I talked with Chris about it. and like Shorebird, because that has like the most hype right now. It's created by the founder of Flutter, right? So that's a kind of big one.
What's the name of that one?
Shorebird.
Shorebird. Okay, I haven't heard about this one.
Yeah. It's Eric Seidel. Uh, is the founder of Flutter. Is working on this actually, which is a pretty interesting company to be in.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm aware that he left Google, but I didn't know what he's doing. So this is interesting.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, I think some of these solutions can coexist. Like Flutter Eval and Shorebird definitely target sort of different um, use cases in a sense. I think Shorebird is going to be pretty much perfect for anyone who just wants to be able to update an Android app. It's gonna let you use the entire Dart SDK and compile that, and it's gonna work super well for anyone who wants to just do that. With the minor exception of like the security stuff that I talked about before. And Dart Eval is sort of targeting like a broader, like, oh, you can actually update iOS apps, which is like the number one challenge in making something like this work, is always how do you get iOS, because the App Store policies are so restrictive and they don't want to allow JIT on their platform. But yeah, so I think they can sort of coexist in that sense. And as well, I mean, I know that they have some plan to possibly do something like Dart Eval in the future, or possibly using WebAssembly, which would be really cool to see. So there's going to be like multiple options for people out there.
Have you tried reaching out to these other places besides Chris's project of Hydro SDK?
Yeah, I mean, I've like introduced myself to Eric, and but not a ton besides that.
And what was Eric's reply? I'm just kind of curious because this is the first time I heard it. Like, I know he's been kind of hinting at looking at working at something, but I didn't know he actually announced something yet.
Yeah, I mean, we just like said hi to each other, and I said like, very nice to meet you. It's really cool that you're working on this, and he said the same to me.
Oh, okay, it's too bad that it couldn't. But I think they're targeting more enterprises. What I see when I looked at some of the stuff just now. So that's interesting. And actually, it's kind of funny. Like, I almost feel like looking at this page from Eric, it's like, okay, the guy that created Flutter, maybe he's so frustrated that he couldn't get this code push that he just left Google to work on this idea. I don't know. I'm guessing it's probably not. It could be one of the reasons, but I doubt it. I think it's just you want to kind of do something else. I also find it kind of interesting that a lot of people who've worked on Flutter or worked with Flutter continue to work with Flutter and even try to make their own ventures out of it, which is super interesting.
Yeah, it's just like the developer experience of Flutter is still probably the best. Like, even now that there's like Compose and Swift UI, obviously those are great, but they're not cross-platform, so Flutter still has the advantage.
Well, Apple has no intention, I think, to ever make that cross-platform. But I mean, maybe. I mean, Swift is now cross-platform, right? Same with C#. But I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was Apple who made it cross-platform. I think some other person.
It could be. I don't know.
Yeah, I really like Swift, and I want to make it cross-platform.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think they're just trying to push it, but I don't know. That's a good question. I thought they did, but maybe I'm wrong. But I mean, for them to, I think their Swift UI may be too much ingrained with like their SDK to really make it cross-platform. I mean, you have to rebuild all this stuff, right?
Right.
As opposed to Flutter, which is not really platform. It's really platform agnostic from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if you've seen like the Arc browser at all, but that's a project where they're actually taking Swift UI and getting it to run on Windows to build their browser. So if they can make that work, then it would be totally cool, because then that would be available across at least Windows. I'm not sure about it, if they have any plans to bring it to Android.
Yeah, I don't know what the plan is. I think I've actually heard of this browser. It sounds familiar because I think I've seen they have a very specific browser that they're working on, right? The browser company.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be like the browser that is really so much better. It's supposed to help somehow. They wanted to re-engineer how everything worked.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't tried it personally, but it looks like a pretty cool idea.
Well, the other thing, an important part, right, is that you're still working on this so far. Apple hasn't snatched you up. It seems like everybody who works at Apple drops whatever interesting stuff they're working on because I guess they have to. I'm guessing it's probably part of the talk, right? And I'm sure that the interesting thing that they're working on is probably what got them picked up in the first place. So it's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah,
And I mean, the reason this came up is because you just did a release recently, I believe, and you put it posted on Reddit, which is how I saw it.
yeah. So there's been a few releases, and they've gotten varying levels of interest. I think you know probably the biggest release before this one was when I switched to using bytecode, and it was like, oh my god, this is now 250 times faster. And it was like, wait, what? 250 times faster? Things don't just get 250 times faster. Um, but yeah, I mean, 0.6 is a pretty big update because it introduces this whole hot swap mechanism. Um, there was not a great way to actually do code push before. Like you could have it run interpreted code, but there wasn't a great way to like say, oh, I want to go like target this part of my app and update that, and target this part of my app and update that, and have the rest of it continue running normally. Um, and yeah, so I think when you're looking at the project, it works today for a lot of use cases. You're not just going to be able to run any Flutter code because there's still a lot of features that aren't supported. Um, you can't run a pub package, for example, yet. But these are all things that I'm working on.
But obviously, you can pull in that pub package and use it within your code, no? Or you really cannot.
Not yet. And the reason for that is because if I added that ability right now, most of the time it still wouldn't work. So even if you were able to pull in the pub packages, the vast majority of them are, and the people who create pub packages are generally pretty good Dart developers, and they use a lot of sort of advanced Dart features because they want to make good packages that are like all using all of the taking advantage of everything that Dart has to offer. But what that means is that most of them are using features that Dart doesn't support yet.
Yeah, you already support quite a lot of widgets, which is good. I mean, I guess, does it take a lot of time to add a widget, or it just depends on the widget?
Not really at all. Yeah, it's pretty quick to have the widgets. I think the bigger thing that's like more important in terms of support is Dart features. So if you look at the Dart eval page, it has a list of all the Dart features that Dart eval currently supports, and it's at about like 60% of like major Dart features right now. But there's a few big ones that aren't supported yet. Like finally isn't supported. We support try catch, but finally isn't supported yet. Mixins are not supported at all right now. And what else? Like switch statements. And the only reason I haven't supported switch statements yet, because it would be really easy, is just because they're going to be completely changed with Dart 3. So I didn't want to go and like add support and then have to rip it all out.
I mean, when Dart 3 was announced, where you're like, oh, crap.
I was like, oh my god, this is going to be terrible. But yeah, no, I think actually the Dart team's migration plan for it is really smart and makes it a lot easier for me. Like, they're not going to be changing any of the core Dart API, so all of your existing Flutter code is going to work right out of the box, and Dart eval is going to continue to work with all your existing Flutter code. The only thing is, if you are starting to actually try to make use of those new features, Dart eval won't be able to do that on day one, but it's certainly something that I'm going to support as soon as I can. And I think, just like, if nothing else, then for the desire to support switch statements, I'm going to try to do that probably before some of these other more esoteric Dart 2 features like async generators and isolates, right?
Yeah. I mean, what's the typical process? Do you start from Flutter side and then work on Dart, or were you just working on Dart and then whenever you need to work on something in Flutter, then you will maybe go back to Dart and then go back to Flutter, or how do you usually work on this?
Um, so I think when I'm looking at it, mostly I'm starting from like what the use case is. Like, what is someone going to want to do with Flutter eval? What are they going to want to try to code push, or how do I get this thing to work? So I'll take like a sample project or write some of my own code and then see what doesn't work and then see what I need to fix to make that work. And yeah, so a lot of times I'll just be adding another widget, but sometime that'll be, like adding an actual new feature. And right now, one of the big things I'm trying to work on is getting some pub packages to compile. So you can already do like network requests with Dart eval, but you have to use the built-in HTTP client, um, which is not like as great to work with as package HTTP. It's a little bit complicated, and you have to use streams. Um, so yeah, one of the big ones that I'd like to get to work is just being able to compile package HTTP, so people can use that. And then the other place where I'm starting from is just GitHub issues. People are saying like, "Oh, I need this thing to work," and so I'll go and usually prioritize that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, has there been quite a lot of, I mean, you said people are using this in production, right?
I believe so. Yeah, I've been contacted by a few companies um, who've they've never ended up like sponsoring the project or anything, but I'm fairly sure that there are people using it, especially for calculators. If you see an app that's a Flutter calculator, it's a good chance it was made with Dart eval.
I mean, I'm kind of curious about, is there a way to do like, I don't know, a periodic check for like updates or like on demand where you can say, okay, click this button to update and it'll grab the latest version? Because I'm just imagining like with a brand new app I give to my client to use, they report a bug, I find it, I fix it with Flutter eval, post up a new EVC and tell them, to click a button or just wait a minute and then it's going to be updated.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Right now, it's just like, or I'm just covering like the most basic use cases. So you have to restart the app, and then it should automatically check for an update, um, which sort of does what I want it to do right now. And of course, if you want to, you could go and look at the source code of the hot swap widget and make your own, which works however you want it to work. But yeah, certainly in the future, like one thing that I definitely want to focus on is the like full end-to-end experience of using it. So um, even the fact that you have to help self-host updates is not necessarily ideal for a lot of companies. So and at the future, I'd like to make like a full hosted solution where you're paying some monthly fee, and then you get this whole admin dashboard, and it you know like really well developed like CLI tooling and ways to do A/B tests and target specific portions of your audience, and have it just handle all that for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also interested to know about the use cases of like, um, how do you handle situations where, you know, you have an EBC file for one? I mean, I guess you could have different EBC files for different versions of the app. So you'd have like 0.1 would have to point to this file, 0.2 would point to a different file. That's how you kind of handle the issue of people having different versions, because one of the worst problems about mobile apps is people just don't like to update. That's like, like, and so I guess you could do it that way rather than always pointing to a specific file, because if they're running an old version, they try to point to the newest one. They may not have the right code there that can get updated, etc. And also, yeah, maybe handle retries, or if they have a bad network or whatever, right? Like this kind of issue, because sometimes like you may fix a bug and then if somehow they cannot get the update, then they have to deal with the bug, like somehow, you know what I mean? Like, how can we handle this kind of situation? These are just some of the things that come to my mind. Like if you can somehow cache it or whatever, that'd just be great. But
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely looking into all this stuff, and I think one of the big things is going to be getting it to be able to do automatic updates based on like diffing from your code as well. So it's going to be able to at some point, right? Like you're going to be able to just, instead of, because right now what you have to do is you create a separate project which contains the code you want to update, and then you go and you like write a function that updates a certain piece of code, which is pretty easy, but it would still be more convenient if you could just change your existing project's code, and then it would go and see what had changed since the last update, and figure out exactly what it needs to do and what it needs to update.
this is cool. I mean, like, is there any updates happen to Dart eval or Flutter eval within the immediate future that we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I mean, so immediate future, I'm going to be adding support for try catch finally, full support for that, and there's a few other like easy updates that I want to do. Adding support for spreads, adding support for what else? Like turn. No, we don't support ternary expressions, but like the Elvis operators and stuff like that. That's all really easy to add. Um, and yeah, I mean, longer term, my goal right now is really to get pub packages to compile. So getting package HTTP working would be a great first step for that. And animations as well is another big one that I'd like to get to work. So that obviously relies on mixins using a ticker provider state mixin, and I would really like to get that to work.
Yeah, I'm just thinking to myself, like, I think one of the things that people like to do, at least out here, is that all of a sudden you get like a Christmas themed app and the animation at the beginning is updated, this kind of stuff. So I can imagine doing that. You just don't have the icon upgrade, which is what a lot of people also do. Like one of my apps has now got, I don't know, it looks like Christmas or something, the app icon.
No, very
I don't
festive.
know what holiday that is. Maybe it's supposed to be Easter. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So technically, you can already sort of do this stuff in Flutter Eval. You just have to create your own bridge class to your own If you know what it's going to be, you can create a bridge class, and but that's a little bit too much work for most people. So I'd certainly like to make it easier.
Yeah, it sounds pretty cool. I mean, is there anything else that you want us to know about Darteval or Flutterval before we sign off? Because I think we've spent quite a bit of time kind of talking through it, and it looks pretty cool. I mean, I'm thinking about all the use cases I would love to use it for. And so, like I said, like sometimes like I have an app that I'm working on, and it would be nice to be able to just kick out a version and just say, okay, close the app and reopen it. you know?
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I think you know, it's always fun to like have a package that people want to use. And one fun thing that happened to me recently was this Chinese user went and like uh, really did a deep dive into Flutter Eval and made a bunch of blog posts about it, where they like looked at my code very deeply and sort of documented all of it from like start to finish, how it works, how it's functions. And I had reached out to them, and I thought that was really interesting. Because I ended up actually using a lot of what they wrote inside of Dart Eval and just translated it from Chinese. But yeah, I think that's really cool, like the sort of like global aspect of it. That some random user in China can just like come find my package and like do a deep dive into it and look at how it works.
Yeah, the Flutter community in China is quite big. I think it's probably because a lot of help from Google. I think.
Yeah, yeah. And one other user that had like reached out to me was, and I don't have any idea how to say this, is like FJCGY, whatever, CGY something. They created this package called Flutter Smooth. I don't know if you've heard about that at all.
No.
And so that was really, so what that does is it actually decouples your like build speed of your code from the display update rate that Flutter publishes. So you can have code that runs at sub 60 FPS, and it will still render your app at 60 FPS. So, and it specifically, I think it targets scrolling. So even if like your app's build speed is, like 10 FPS, you can still be scrolling and feel like it's 60 FPS. And we had talked a little.
I think I know this one actually. The demo is very familiar. I think I remember this.
Yeah,
Isn't this about the jank problem or something? Is this where it
yeah.
originally came from? Okay.
There were a few problems I was aiming to solve, but one of the problems is actually code push. Like if you have something like Dart eval where it's running like usually like 10 to 15 times slower than your normal Dart code. Um, and if that happens, in a lot of cases, that's not really a problem because you're not actually limited by the build speed of your own code in most Flutter apps. But if you are, if you have some really complex build methods and a lot of stuff going on in them, and you're actually getting a slowdown from Dart eval, then something like Flutter Smooth could take it and make it so it doesn't even matter, right? You're still getting 60 FPS even if your build method is running slower.
Yeah. I do remember this one. And the reason I know this guy, the name sounded familiar, but now I know who you were talking about. He wrote the Flutter Rust bridge, and I looked at that one quite deeply.
Yeah, he's got a few cool projects.
Yeah, I reached out to him to come onto the show, but I think he said he was way too busy. I might need to ping him again. Maybe he's got some free time.
Yeah, yeah. It's so yeah, we had he had been like we had been talking a little bit just over through GitHub and talking about if we could sort of use Flutter Smooth in to make Darty like the speed of it not even matter, which would be really cool. And so yeah, I mean, it's just the collaboration of the Flutter community is pretty amazing. I think for Flutter Smooth specifically, like he actually needs to make a few patches to the Flutter engine. Um, but that could be something that Flutter Eval could explore in the future too. I think Shorebird right now, they're actually building their own custom version of the Flutter engine to achieve their actual hot patching. Um, and so it'd be interesting if Dart Eval just like patch the engine with Flutter Smooth to get the performance all the way up.
Yeah, I mean, I want to see what they're working on. It sounds interesting. I mean, if you have the creator of Flutter working on this, it must be something interesting, and then he must really understand what's going on and what can be done. I'm just wondering how it will work. Where I mean, is there things going to be given back to the Flutter team or Flutter community? That'd be nice to have. Of course, I mean, they have to have something for themselves too, right? Because they're a business, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think their whole code is open source.
Okay, I guess they maybe just go into consulting work, but it's interesting that they're making a whole business out of this.
Yeah, it's it's something that I thought about. I'm not sure how much interest there is. We'll see. So there's, I wish them the best of success, and I'm sure that Eric knows what he's doing.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, we've had quite a bit of time, and I've gotten to know this project quite well, and I'm hoping that it can stick around for a while, not like some of the others that have come and gone. Hopefully, it's going to come and never leave. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Alan.
Thank you for coming on.